Welcome to the third installment of Dave's FAVE500, my thankless task of selecting 500 albums from my record library here and elsewhere in the house. Albums that I think are really worth hearing. And as I indicated in the very first video in this series, I'd long had this ambition to do feature one album and do a video on one album, and I started that a couple of years ago, and I think I got to about 7 or 8 albums before I just got distracted with something else. So I thought it'd be good to do them in chunks of 5 and hopefully not spend too much time on them, but just to give people a clue as to what these albums are about, who made them, why you should maybe like them, and where you might go next if you do like them. So, one other thing that I every now and again I put these videos together where I'm talking, I'm kind of walking and talking or sitting and talking about things other than music. And I posted one a couple of days ago from when I was in Newcastle wrestling with how do we get back to a world where we can have sensible political debate amongst our friends and colleagues without being judged, without taking sides. And I thank people who've watched that video. I know it's absolutely not for everybody. Maybe I'd express myself slightly differently if I did it again, but there's no script, so it is what it is. But I've had some great comments from people, most of whom are facing the same dilemma. How the hell do we get back to sensible debate? But anyway, I thought I'd acknowledge the appearance of that video before I leap into these next 5 albums that I think people should take time to listen to. So let me start to talk about jazz. Like, as I've said, these 500 albums are going to be all over the map in terms of musical genre. The first one in this 5 is going to be jazz. Now, I've got this schizophrenic relationship with jazz. I was curious about jazz. I listened to prog bands like King Crimson and their Lizard album that has saxophone on it and is commonly regarded as jazz elements within it. And I listened to Van der Graaf Generator with David Jackson playing saxophone all over their catalogue. So I was familiar with the saxophone, but jazz was a mystery to me. And I, like a lot of people, I started to explore jazz more in the CD era because suddenly old jazz albums and compilations were packaged for CD and cheap to buy. And one of the problems I think that puts a lot of people off is that the cheapest entry points to jazz are often tracks that were recorded in the 40s and 50s or even earlier, early 50s, before the quality of the sound became something more comparable to the present day, or at least the present day back in the 70s and the 80s, before the digital boom, if you like. And I think a lot of people would just get put off because you buy these cheap compilations and you think, this is jazz? Well, this is for my dad, not for me. But anyway, like most people, or like a lot of people, not everyone as I've suggested, but like a lot of people, I persisted and gradually built up a jazz collection that blossomed in the 1990s when reissues were abundant and mega cheap. I used to buy loads of albums, Blue Notes and Verve albums and so on for a fiver brand new pressings. You wouldn't get them for that sort of price today. And this was deep into the 1990s. Anyway, I first got into this album because of this album by another artist that I already liked, and that is Joni Mitchell. And I can't tell you what album, what number this album was in her catalogue, but it's a tribute to Charles Mingus. The album is called Mingus. I understand that Mingus himself wasn't too enamored with this but he died either during its making or soon afterwards. But I'm going to pick a Charles Mingus album, and it's Mingus Mingus Charles Mingus, bass player. This was recorded and released, I think, in 1959. To me, it's at the end of jazz. Well, one of the things, let me just try and draw a distinction between what I dislike about jazz and what I like about jazz. What I dislike about jazz is often what people think its very essence, and that is improvisation. I'm not 100% all in on improvisation, and I never like, whether it's shredding guitarists or very late period John Coltrane, where he's squeezing as many notes as possible, into whatever time period it is. I'm much more interested, and I don't like the improv where they go from one instrument to another and then come back to the theme at the beginning. It's kind of predictable, boring, doesn't really float my boat. What I really like is jazz that is composed, that it is written out, that it is it's very, very carefully crafted, and you can tell that this is a piece of music or pieces of music that's long in the making. And Mingus is one of the artists that I gravitate towards, because someone's going to tell me, big jazz aficionado is going to tell me that Mingus was brilliant on improv, but it seems to me is that this music is crafted. At times it's got a very kind of languid late night style. Others has echoes of the kind of big band sound, but everything sounds just so well controlled and well constructed. Everything is kind of under control here. And the reason why I went from Joni Mitchell to this one is that she had a track on the Mingus album called Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, which is a Mingus song. So she did a version of that, and it appears on this particular album. Now, I can't say much else about it. I've been thinking about doing a video on my favourite jazz albums. I've been separating about 20 of those albums and thinking about why they stand out from the others. But I'm really struggling to kind of put a video together. Even though he's a bass player, it's unless I'm mistaken, there's only one kind of bass solo in this one, and that's on the track Fables of Faubus. The rest of the time, he's kind of a band leader, letting other musicians, take the front of the stage, as it were. But anyway, if you like jazz or are open to jazz that is composed and controlled and melodic and works well on a Sunday afternoon or an evening, this is a great album. Charles Mingus, Mingus Our Home. Right, that's a long chat about jazz, isn't it? God knows how long this video is going to be. Right, another artist, West Coast artist, 70s artist, went out into the 80s and the 90s, and then eventually he died. And this is an album by Warren Zevon, and it's called Sentimental Hygiene. Now this, I'd heard Werewolves of London. Not a big fan of this guy's voice, but he has got a good sense of humour, and he can write very tender songs as well. But this album rocks. It's the first full album that I bought of his. I think 1986 it came out. It's got an absolute who's who of great artists on this album. Let me see if I can just pick up some of the names here. We've got all of REM. Michael Stipe only sings on one track, but the rest of the band play on most of the tracks. You've got Neil Young on blistering guitar on the title track, which is fantastic. You've also got Bob Dylan plays a harmonica on a track called The Factory. And Boom Boom Mancini is like REM, but with Zevon up front. Don Henley sings harmony. Who have you got? Stan Lynch from the Heartbreakers. Mike Campbell from the Heartbreakers as well. Anyway, there's loads. But as I say, this album kind of rocks. Even the kind of ballady songs like Reconsider Me and what is it, The Heartache, they chug along. Great driving music, really good. So I love this album because it's just so upfront. It's right in your face. It's a perfect driving album. Really good. And Neil Young, who, you know, was in his the 80s period, which many think that he was kind of past his best, performs brilliantly on the title track here. So that's Zevon and Sentimental Hygiene. The third artist is an artist that I did a rundown of what I thought were the top 10 albums from a vast catalogue, and this guy's been around since the 1960s, and he's still recording and performing today. He is loved by everybody in the VC, and it is Van Morrison. But I'm not talking about this album, Astral Weeks. This is the one that always appears in the top 100, 500, 1,000 albums you must hear. You've got to hear Astral Weeks. But man, this is the worst entry point for Van Morrison. If this is your entry to Van Morrison, which a lot of it is improvised, very loose recording, very intimate, it is... There's a word that I can't, that's on the tip of my tongue. You just cannot, it's hard to get your head around. Maybe if you were steeped in jazz, maybe it would make more sense to you. But anyway, Astral Weeks, it is a great album, but don't go there if it's your first entry into Van. The album I'm going to pick is an album that I think he did in 1991, and it's a double album called Hymns to the Silence. Now, Van Morrison kind of started out with them in the 60s, kind of playing R&B, or, you know, old-fashioned R&B, as it were. And then he morphed into this kind of folk, troubadour kind of persona, which produced albums like Weed and Fleece and Astral Weeks. Bit of jazz-inflected Moondance, another fantastic album. We'll come back to that one in the 500 undoubtedly. And then he entered in the late 70s and the 80s. He's one of these guys who likes to, he's searching for some spiritual kind of enlightenment. And I think he dabbled in a lot of different things, a lot of different kind of spiritual movements. And that interest in spirituality sort of came into his music, and some of the 80s albums are some of the most beautifully crafted and melodic songs you're ever going to hear. Later on, you go back, I'm coming back to this album in just a second, but much later on, more recent years, the last 10 or 15 years, he's kind of rekindled his interest in kind of skiffle and big band jazz and so on, and it's kind of become pretty pedestrian. There's the odd album that pops out that is great to is a great album, but a lot of it has become fairly pedestrian. But you gotta admire this guy's ability to continually be creative. And one of the things that's worth saying about him is that in the early albums, and you hear it most on the Double Live album, It's Too Late to Stop Now, where his vocal style is kind of yelping. He's like a yappy dog, and it's no wonder people just don't like his voice. But as his voice became more controlled and it matured, it became a beautiful, rich instrument, instantly recognizable. And even now, deep into his 70s, I imagine, maybe he's 80, who knows, but his voice is still incredible. So his voice has maintained that kind of quality all through those years. But why Hymns to the Silence? Because on this album, you get his kind of gospel, you get his soul. He does songs that were covered by late period Tom Jones, which were beautiful. Carrying a Torch is the best example of that one. But the title track is 8 minutes. Hymns to the Silence is kind of about trying to get, in a spiritual sense, get to that stillness. And it's just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And even though he's an absolute curmudgeon, there's one or two tracks on here. Why Must I Always Explain is a beautiful track where he bemoans having to talk to journalists, people asking him stupid questions. but most of the album is kind of upbeat here, or upbeat with a twinge of nostalgia. And there's a track here, there's a couple of like talking blues type tracks. One of them is called On Hindford Street, which is about him being maybe an 9-year-old on the edge of Belfast, going out into the country or the post-industrial landscape around the city, and just exploring, going fishing, going bird watching, maybe riding a bike, going out and coming back, watching the sunset, and so on and so forth. And he talks this. It's a piece of beautiful poetry, and there's a really good line he says where he repeats, "It's always being now. It's always being now," and that's about, not at the age of 7 or 8 or 9. He's not thinking about the past. He's not worrying about the future. He's just enjoying what's happening right now. And it's absolutely gorgeous. And I think that this, although it's very hard to get a hold of on album these days, on vinyl, I think even his CDs are pretty difficult to get a hold of, but probably streaming, I'd select some of the tracks from here. On Hindford Street, Why Must I Always Explain, and Hymns to the Silence Itself. An absolutely beautiful piece of work. Another artist that is endlessly creative and has been around for a very, very long time, and his musical style has changed quite significantly, is Nick Cave. And this particular album, Push the Sky Away, is the one that I want to showcase today. Now, Nick Cave, I didn't really know Nick Cave other than John Peel playing Release the Bats by the Birthday Party, all that very raucous, aggressive, kind of post-punk, almost as if kind of holding on to that punk ethos, but that stuff more or less passed me by, because at the time I was into Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Spandau Ballet, and other 80s giants like early Depeche Mode and The Cure and things like that. So I didn't want to be shouted at in the way that the Birthday Party and early Nick Cave was shouting at us. And then I got back on I got into Nick Cave properly when he released Murder Ballads. And that's purely because the single Where the Wild Roses Grow, that duet with Kylie Minogue in the video, is just so compelling. I thought, wow, this is interesting. This is not super aggressive Nick Cave, even though the lyrical content on the album is very dark. Murder Ballads, what do you expect? But anyway, I then know there was The Boatman's Call, and then there was No More Shall We Part, and I kind of equate Nick Cave's albums as like, it's if you're standing there and someone throws a ball at you and you catch it, and then they throw another ball at you and you still got the first ball and you're catching that one, and then they throw another and another and another, and you keep dropping the balls. And that's my relationship with Nick Cave's music over the years. He is so prolific that his albums come out before you fully consume the last one, as it were. So a lot of his albums, that when I put them on, I think this is marvelous, absolutely fantastic music. But it was this one, Push the Sky Away, that stopped me in my tracks. And it's because Warren Ellis, his partner in crime, very prominent member of the band, has put together a whole bunch of sonic trickery, loops, electric violin, and it's no surprise that they got into doing soundtracks as well, of which I've got most of them here as well. But this album really came out very, very strongly, and it's just brilliant from beginning to end. But the track that stopped me in my tracks was the title track, Push the Sky Away, which closes the album. And I won't talk about all of the individual albums, individual tracks, because it is almost universally brilliant. But the last track has this kind of organ or keyboard. I'm not saying it's a loop, but it's just got this refrain that Warren Ellis is almost certainly playing it, and I think I've seen it when I saw him on stage, and he's he's got this small keyboard, I think, that he sits on his lap, and I think maybe it was that, but it's got this beautiful, mournful kind of keyboard backing that it's Nick Cave is singing over him like, but just that musical backing. I think the track lasts about 5 minutes, but I could easily listen to that backing on a loop for half an hour without getting bored. It is just one of the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever heard. It's absolutely fantastic. And I've seen Nick Cave twice. The first time was in the early 1990s, not in concert. It was at Portobello Market in London, and in the distance, standing head and shoulders above everyone else in a dark suit, strolling up the middle of the road on market day, was Nick Cave. It was, you couldn't miss who he was. But I saw him last year at the NEC, back end of last year, and it was kind of a bit of a disappointment because all the kind of nuance and the sound effects that are very prominent in his music of this period, and Ghost Teen is a really good example of that as well, and Skeleton Tree. But it kind of got lost as he became a bad seed, and it was like back to the really punchy, aggressive. Okay, I'm back. The camera overheated. I must have been talking for too long. I'm sorry. I think where I got to, I was talking about Nick Cave live, and that is his performance on his latest tour promoting the Wild God album is just too aggressive and too bad seedy for my particular taste. But anyway, I think he's great. I think he's one of 3 musical greats that have had long careers, are endlessly creative, and they're happy to create albums based on a musical theme and then switch to the next album. So every album is kind of different. And they're Dylan, they're Van Morrison, and they're Nick Cave. And I'm not including Springsteen, and I'm not including Joni Mitchell, because I just think those 3 artists are the ones who are closest to writing poetry and putting together a vast catalogue of super interesting music. So Nick Cave, absolutely love it. I think I'm going to be rediscovering Nick Cave albums for as long as I'm around. If you don't know Nick Cave and Nick Cave's music, and not everybody does, I was watching a video yesterday of an interview hosted by Alex at Beer and Vinyl, and he was talking to Ben Rankins about Ben's love of Nick Cave, and his knowledge of Nick Cave is stellar. So he's got a vast collection. Is he a completist? He might be close to it. But anyway, the video is brilliant, well worth watching. But at one point in the video, Ben describes Nick Cave's music to a T. And I'm going to include a little clip of that section right now.
I think I've struggled both from the asking of the question and receiving the question of, I'll say, oh man, I was at work and I was like, man, I went to a great concert this past weekend, best concert of my life. And they're like, oh, who'd you go see? I said, I went to go see Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. And of course they have no idea who the fuck I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But they'll ask the question of like, what kind of music is it? And I'm like, alternative, I'm like, I don't know. And so kind of going off what you said of like, people call this like the blues record, but like, it's not like people are like listening to Lightning Hopkins and they're like, that's the Nick Cave record that I love, sort of thing. And so at this point in the career, how do you describe what genre are we even into right now?
Well, I've heard a term before which I quite like, ascribed to them in this period in the 90s as called the New Traditionalists.
The New Traditionalists, okay?
Yes, because you can hear all of that in there, those that influence, because Bad Seeds are more a piano-driven band than a guitar-driven band.
Yes.
Even though they have had some of the greatest underground guitarists run through that band. And that's what I think makes them different. So I can hear, like, I wouldn't say that they sound like Bob Dylan or Leonard Cohen, but you can hear the influence, especially lyrically, in there. And then there is that sort of, it's like a, almost, because the band at this point has got half Australian, half European. So it's kind of like an interpretation of American South Gothic blues, country, you know, all
right.
woven in, and coming from the idea with a punk ethos and punk attitude of how you do things.
Anyway, Nick Cave. Anyway, my last album in the 5. So number 15 in Dave's FAVE500 is an album by the Jayhawks, Tomorrow the Green Grass. Now, I discovered the Jayhawks, the album before this, Hollywood Town Hall. They released a single called Waiting for the Sun. And I picked this up probably for 50 pence, not knowing what it was, but brilliant, loved it. So then started buying the albums. Now this is a reissue, or this is a first issue on vinyl. Bought the CD, of course. Back in the 90s, it wasn't available then. So this is a kind of a reissue from recent years. But Jayhawks, again, long career. They come and they go. They've got is it Gary Lewis and Mark Olson who kind of set the band up. Both guitarists, both singers. Olson left and the band continued. But the sound is Americana. It's a bit birdsy. It reminds me... who else does it remind me of? It'll come to me. It doesn't matter. But it's like the Byrds, but without the Rickenbacker. So you've got twin electric guitars, acoustic guitars. You have bass and drums. You have a little bit of organ, a tiny bit of strings on this album. You also have violin on this album on a few tracks. And it's beautiful. It's. I went through a period in the 1990s where I did a deep dive on Americana, and although most of it is on CD, the collection I picked up over a handful of years is pretty vast. And it's I talked about doing a jazz video. I've been meaning to do an Americana video too, but just trying to pick the best ones has been a real challenge. But the Jayhawks, yeah, they kind of rocks in places. It's kind of country, but too rough for being modern country. So it's definitely like Americana. But yeah, I love this album. Really, really great. I'd recommend it. The Sound of Lies, I think, is the one that most critics think is the best. But this is the one that I go back to most often. Tomorrow the Green Grass. So longer than I hoped for. I'm sorry if you're still here. Amazing. Anyway, that's numbers 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 of Dave's FAVE500. I shall see you soon. Bye for now.